Welcome. What I'm going to show you here in lesson 3.10 is how you can use addition and subtraction to describe patterns or to create a sequence with decimals. What we have here is we have a sequence of numbers, and what we need to do with the sequence of numbers is we need to determine the rule for this sequence, for this pattern, and we need to figure out what this missing term is right here. Okay, now the way we start this out is we first need to decide if the numbers are increasing or decreasing. I could see here that I start out with one whole, and from one whole it then increases to 3 wholes, and then to 5 wholes, and then to 7 wholes. So I could tell that my rule is going to be adding by a certain amount. Alright, now once I figure out that the pattern is increasing, I next need to take two consecutive numbers in the sequence here, and I need to find the difference between the two numbers. So typically what we do is we start out with our first two numbers in the sequence and we find their difference, because if it's a pattern, if it's a true pattern, then the difference between each number, each consecutive numbers, is going to be the same throughout. So I'm going to take 1 3/10 and 3 5/10, and I'm going to find their difference. We know that difference means the answer to a subtraction problem. So I'm going to take 3 5/10, and I'm going to take away 1 3/10 from it. When I do that, I get as my answer 2 2/10. So what seems to be happening is this pattern here, these numbers seem to be increasing by 2 2/10. So my rule appears to be for this sequence of numbers is add 2 2/10. Now I could check these numbers right here. I could take 5 7/10 and subtract 3 5/10 just to make sure that the difference between those two consecutive numbers in the sequence is also 2 2/10. And if I do that, I take 7 minus 5, I get 2, I get 5 minus 3, which is also 2, and then once again that decimal comes straight down, and the difference between those two numbers is 2 2/10. The difference then between 5 7/10 and 7 9/10 will also be 2 9/10. So now, in order to determine what this missing term is, all I would have to do is I would have to take this 7 9/10 that's here, and I would have to add 2 2/10 to that, because we already determined that the rule was add 2 2/10. Therefore, to figure out what the missing term is, you would take that 7 9/10, which is right before that unknown term, and add 2 2/10 to it. Therefore, I would get my answer of 10 1/10. Therefore, my missing term would be 10 1/10, which would then match my rule of add 2 2/10. Here's another example here. We have a sequence of numbers, and we first need to figure out the rule for the pattern of this sequence here. And once again, I could see that the numbers are increasing because I'm starting out with 5/10, and then I'm increasing to 1 8/10, to 3 1/10, to 4 4/10. Therefore, I know my rule is going to be adding by a certain amount. I need to figure out what that certain amount is. And like we did with the last problem, is we need to figure out how much it's increasing by finding the difference between two consecutive numbers. Typically, once again, we would start out by taking our first two numbers that are right there for us, and determining their difference. So we know when we subtract, we need to have the larger number on top, and we would take that 1 8/10, and we would subtract 5/10 from that 1 8/10. I could fill that in with a 0. I would subtract, and I would get my 1 3/10. So it appears that the pattern here is, and the rule is add 1 3/10. Now, just to make sure, I'm going to take this 1 8/10, and I'm going to add this 1 3/10 to the 1 8/10. And if I add those together, I would get 3 1/10, which, as you see, matches my rule. That next number is 3 1/10. Therefore, it appears the rule for the sequence is add 1 3/10. Now what I need to do is I need to determine my unknown term that's here. So I would take the number that comes right before my unknown term, which is 4 4/10. I would then add my 1 3/10 to that, because each number appears to be increasing by that 1 3/10. So I would take the 4 4/10, add 1 3/10 to it, and I would get my answer of 5 7/10. Therefore, the unknown term in this instance would be 5 7/10. Here's one last example before I have you try one on your own. Now again we have a sequence of numbers here, and there's a pattern. Okay, and the first thing I need to do is figure out if the pattern is increasing or decreasing. Unlike the last two examples that we did here, we could see that the numbers in this pattern are decreasing. Okay, it goes from 6 85/100 to 5 73/100 to 4 61/100. Therefore, my rule is going to be subtracting by a certain amount. So I need to figure out what that amount is. And to do that, you need to figure out the difference between two consecutive numbers in the sequence. So I need to take my 6 85/100, and I need to find the difference between 6 85/100 and 5 73/100. I'm subtracting the smaller amount from the larger amount, and what I'm left with in this case is 1 12/100. If this is a true pattern, which it is, I know that the difference between each consecutive number will be 1 12/100. Therefore, my rule for this is subtract 1 12/100. Now, in order to determine what my unknown term is, I would take that 4 61/100, and I would subtract 1 12/100 from this, because from each number to the next, it is decreasing, it is subtracting by 1 12/100. I would take 4 61/100, subtract 1 12/100, and I would get as my answer 3 49/100. So my unknown term is 3 49/100. My rule is subtract 1 12/100. Now I want you to try one on your own. So here's your next sequence. What I want you to do is I want you to figure out what the rule for the sequence for the pattern is, and I also want you to figure out what this unknown term is. So press that pause button, try to solve it, and then once you're set, press the play button to see if you solved it right. Alright, so hopefully what you figured out here is that you first need to decide if the rule is increasing or decreasing, and you see here that the numbers are getting larger, therefore your rule should be adding by a certain amount. In order to figure out what that amount is, you take two consecutive numbers, and you find the difference between those two consecutive numbers. The larger number has to be on top when you're subtracting, so you're taking 3/10 away from the 1 5/10, and what you should have been left with is 1 2/10. So your rule for this sequence here is add 1 2/10. I could take this 1 2/10, add it to my 3 9/10 to check to make sure, see if that is actually in fact the rule, to see if I get 1 5/10, and I notice that if I do that, I am getting 1 5/10, which matches my rule, add 1 2/10. Now, in order to figure out what this unknown term is right here, I take the number that is right before it, which is 1 5/10. I add my 1 2/10 because that's the rule, and each number is increasing by 1 2/10, and I would get my answer of 2 7/10. Therefore, you should have gotten your unknown term as 2 7/10, and your rule as add 1 2/10. And that's how you use addition and subtraction to describe patterns or create sequences using decimals.